Hello and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box. So it was this week last year that the world lost a woman who was most probably the finest, most intriguing, and most tragic iconoclastic female artist of the 20th and 21st centuries. And this is, of course, Sinead O'Connor. Now, Sinead O'Connor's career, her artistry on stage, on record, and her trials and tribulations off stage were always a paradox of supreme confidence and self-assuredness, combined with a kind of almost shrinking and frightened and vulnerable mentality and emotion that was clearly conveyed and clearly apprehended from what she said and what she did, both on stage and off. And this to me is something that we conclude is the combination of someone who had such pure talent, enjoyed utilizing these talents, had such strong views about the world and about life and about the way people treat each other. But at the same time, if she would have been able to have the same effect on the world, expressing these views in a vacuum as she did doing it on stage, she probably would have opted for the vacuum rather than the stage. But of course, that paradox is an impossible one. And so, as all great singers ought to do, she took to the stage, and as all people with strong opinions ought to do, she took to the spotlight. Now, some of her earliest great works were collaborations, and I really like, for instance, the song "Kingdom of Rain" that she sung with the one of the most interesting bands that come out of the 1980s, led by Matt Johnson. It's kind of a one-man band, if you will, that Matt Johnson led, and she had so many other great collaborations. She performed on Roger Waters' version of The Wall that was done in Berlin in 1990 to celebrate the fall of the Berlin Wall. Roger thought that she was somewhat difficult to work with, which wasn't the first person who thought of that. Both, of course, had very strong opinions, but she was probably a bit more temperamental. But if you hear her rendition of Pink Floyd's Mother from that performance, it is absolutely breathtaking, tear-jerking, one of the most beautiful things ever. And then, of course, in terms of songwriting collaborations, her take on a Prince song, Nothing Compares to You, was her biggest ever single. The video was all over. And at that time, we saw the music industry really starting to sink their teeth into her. And they do this with people. Once you've done something that's captured public attention, that's got you fame for all of the right reasons, because it was a beautiful performance of a great song, they try to turn their idea of you, their simplistic inner box, reductionist idea of you, into your image. They really try to limit your visual, emotional, and even musical and ideological dynamic range. And this was something that pisses off a lot of people. Some people just say F you to the music industry. Some have other ways to navigate it. But I felt just from observing all of this that it really pained Sinead much more than it did other artists who didn't have this sort of vulnerability. Steve Miller, for instance, was very good at navigating what the music industry tried to do. Frank Zappa put them on blast. There's so many different ways that people deal with this. And this all culminated in a 1992 appearance on Saturday Night Live, where she was the musical guest. And during her performance, she tore up an image of the Pope, Pope John Paul II at the time, and declared, "Fight the real enemy." And this was something that was very controversial at the time. And it still is among many. It was considered deeply hurtful to practicing Roman Catholics, and even very hurtful to other Christians who think that another Christian denomination ought to be respected. Now, today, if someone were to do this on television, no one would bat an eye, because the Western world and the United States and Ireland have similarly become increasingly a religious societies since the 1990s. And it's not for me to tell you whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But in terms of perception of that act of protest, whether it was misguided or whether it was spot on, there's many different views about this. It's the kind of thing where if she had only waited maybe even 15 years, she could have done it, and people would have called it interesting. People would have been upset, but the overall criticism that was 100% mainstream in 1992, calling for her to be a pariah, that wouldn't have existed. Now, I'm going to lay my cards on the line. I would never tear up the image of a Christian leader from any denomination. I personally see Christians as victims globally, but at the same time, it is true. And in Ireland in particular, there were a lot of instances of many individual parish priests doing horrible things to children, from which many have never recovered. Those two concepts can coexist. The respect for faith groups who are persecuted globally as a whole, and the acknowledgement that justice, however it needs to be served, must be served to victims who have been abused in the most horrific way possible by people who are in that ultimate position of trust. And so I think that, frankly, the world should have had that kind of debate. And I think that even though she did something that many found offensive, I think throwing her to the wolves was something that was just very wrong. Why not have her on a talk show and discuss the issue in an intense, but at the same time sincere way? Why raise the voices? And I really think that that said a lot about how a country that, even as America was pretty damn secular in 1992, it still had this attitude of let's get a good old fashioned lynch mob together and go after this frail young woman making a point that was a very important point to her. Why not at least find out why she did something so offensive? Was it for the sake of it? Well, it turns out it wasn't. It turns out that she really did have something important to say, and about children, no less. So she became a kind of symbol for someone who was a victim of the sensationalist nature of censorship, but also a victim of misunderstanding, because I think a lot of it was motivated by misunderstanding, offensive though it was. She continued to make great music since then, but she fell on what one could say were hard times. There were rumors of suicide attempts. There were rumors of other difficulties in her life. In the years before her death, it did seem that she found peace when she converted to Islam, which again, it changes this narrative that people were trying to put out about her in the early 90s, that she was some sort of atheist radical. She was really someone who was upset about what happened in the faith of her childhood, rather than someone who had lost faith. And it was interesting that she found faith later in life in a different religion, in Islam. Not a lot is known about her death in many ways. I'm not sure how honest the media have been, but at this point, I think it suffice to say, far better to celebrate her life and to understand how someone who doesn't have the ability to bite back and fight back can have their lives ruined by the media. And the lesson there is never apologize to the media. Apologize to people that you've done wrong, but never, ever apologize to the media. Never ever apologize to Wall Street. Never ever apologize to the people that control society, because they are the ones who owe the apologies to us. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.